When you think about church, what exactly comes to mind? Is it some kind of grand cathedral or sanctuary with a beautiful pipe organ set and pews? Or maybe it's something that's more contemporary. Maybe it's a praise and worship band sitting up on a stage. Maybe it's just a simple country church. Regardless of how you look at church in your own past traditions, there are certain things that we all think of, and part and parcel of these things are the rituals and traditions that we hold near and dear. Now, where did these things come from? This isn't going to be some kind of lesson where we dive into the rich history that led up to everything that we see today in the church, but just talking about those institutions in general. Because when we think about the rituals and the ceremonies that make up our faith, oftentimes they become bigger than the thing they're actually trying to represent. At least, unfortunately, that's how a lot of people treat them. If you want evidence of this, look no further than the things that you can and cannot discuss sacrificing in your own church. If there are things that people say, well, we simply can't even imagine what church would look like without X or Y, well, you have to look and say, is X or Y something you actually see in the Bible, or is this something that was created by individuals? That starts giving you a pretty good insight into what your church is based on. A lot of people will look at their faith and they regard certain things as being especially important. These things in more traditional churches are called sacraments, but in a lot of evangelical churches are called ordinances. And basically, the difference between those two is a sacrament is considered something that actually has some kind of blessing that is bestowed upon you as a result of doing it, while an ordinance is something we do because Jesus just said, this is something that you should go do. There's a lot of theology to dig into between the differences between those, but for the sake of this conversation right here, there are two ordinances that we think of when we think of our own faith. And those two ordinances are communion and baptism. Those two things are obviously very core to what we believe. Now, neither one of those two things give you salvation in and of themselves, but they are things that Christ told us to do. Here in your small groups, you're going to talk about those pieces of scripture in at least just a little bit, and actually explore what that means to you. But I want you to just think about how this actually helps you to connect with your faith. Baptism is pretty obvious. What we see in the Bible is a lot of imagery surrounding this idea of ceremonial washing, the idea of washing away our uncleanliness and being born into a new life. This is why we get baptized and why baptism is so important to our faith. It's not that it in and of itself did anything for us, but it helped us to connect on the outside with the decision that we made on the inside. And it's one of the reasons why baptism becomes so important. I can tell you as an individual who I myself was kind of forced or coerced into an act of baptism, even as an adult who already had all the check boxes marked, I found it important to go and make a decision to get baptized again. And that was because I knew that I had made a commitment, not because somebody else did it for me or not because I was coerced, at a summer camp or because of a youth pastor, but because I wanted to take my faith seriously. I knew that I wanted to become a new individual, and as a result of that, I wanted to express on the outside the change that had taken place within. Maybe you're in that situation, and maybe you are somebody who has gone through the whole baptism thing in the past, or maybe not. Maybe when you did it previously, it didn't really mean as much, or maybe you didn't completely understand what it is. And if that's the case, then I urge you to reach out and speak to me about that, to just send me an email or send me a text, talk with your home church host, whoever it is that may be a spiritual mentor in your own life about what baptism is and really what that means. Because it is so much more meaningful than just kind of a thing you go through once because that's our tradition and that's what we do. It's about so much more than that. It's about connecting with something on the outside that you know that you did, and about living a new life, not because of the magic water, but because of what the water represents. But there is a second thing that we know is very important, and that is communion. When Christ led his disciples through the first communion, he was doing something that they would understand as having a very specific meaning. You see, the first thing he would do is he would take a cup that was red, representing his blood, and he would take this and he would bless it and say, "Take this and drink. This is my blood shed for you." The blood represents the life force. It's everything that carries our ability to exist on this mortal plane, and it is the thing that was shed from the sacrifices of countless animals and sacrifices in the years prior. But yet, this was the thing that Christ was saying, I would shed for you. A penalty that he would pay, even though he didn't have to, even though he had no sin about him, that he would shed his own righteous blood for our purposes, for our sin, for our unrighteousness. And then he would try to make it even a little bit more impactful by saying it's not just his blood, this ceremonial thing he is paying, but it's his physical body. He would also take the bread and he would break it. And he would say, this is my body broken for you. Take and eat. Do this in remembrance of me. Christ would do these things and he would end it with that final ordinance, to do this in remembrance of me. It wasn't that we did it because it somehow was magic and it made us holy, but because it reminded us that he is holy and that through his holiness we were made righteous. These two ordinances that we've been given in the Bible aren't magic, and they don't somehow make us perfect Christians, but they do help us to connect with what Christ was trying to truly do. They help us to understand a deeper meaning that sometimes is hard to be able to physically understand without something else to really just kind of hammer the point home. So as you get into your small groups, what I want you to think about is this. What are the things that Christians today hold as being the ultimate of the church experience? And how many of those things are things that if we really challenge them, if we really question them, we would see are rooted in the Bible versus being rooted in how we feel and our own desire to feel righteous? When we talk about rituals and ceremonies in the church, we have to talk about where these things come from because they really put things in perspective. In your groups, you just talked about a lot of the things that, Christ and the Bible tell us to do versus the things that so many people hold in highest esteem and say, well, you can't have a church unless you have this program, unless you have that ceremony, unless you have these elements of the thing that you call a good, healthy church. Well, where does this idea come from? Well, you do see it a little bit in the Old Testament. I mean, there's certainly a set of rituals and a set of practices and ceremonies that people observe, but those rituals existed for a purpose. Something that you'll read here in a second is Isaiah kind of going off on the people during that period of time in the Old Testament when the kingdoms had separated between Israel and Judah, and a lot of people were about to end up having a rude awakening to see that the civic nation of Kingdom of David was going to be broken apart and was going to be taken into captivity into Babylon. Well, during that period of time, Isaiah observes that it's not the ritual itself that I really want. What God truly wants is he wants the meaning. He wants the purpose behind it. And the purpose does not point to our own righteousness. It points to God's glory. But there's a second thing that we end up seeing when it comes to rituals and ceremonies, because most of us don't celebrate the old Jewish ceremonies anymore. Instead, we've made up our own. We've come up with our own idea of what it means to have a healthy church. And where does that come from? Well, there's a little bit of history involved, but it's important to understand that history because it makes a lot of things kind of fall into place. You see, there used to be this idea called Pax Deorum. And the whole point of Pax Deorum was that it was this idea of divine harmony, that all the gods, notice I said gods, were going to be pleased with one another. And if all of the gods were pleased, then there would be peace throughout the Roman Empire. And this was the mentality of the pagan world surrounding the birth of the early church. Well, what ended up happening is you had these early churches which look a lot different than the church that we have today. They focused a lot less around ceremonies and they focused a lot more on how to help other people. And these early churches, they didn't want to be completely outcast and persecuted. Obviously, there was a tremendous amount of persecution of the early church in these days. So what they did is they adopted some mentalities of the Pax Deorum. And in doing that, they didn't sit here and adopt necessarily pagan rituals and traditions, but they did adopt the same form. The idea of having liturgies and hymns and structure, things that bring all of the believers of that faith into compliance with one another. In a sense, orthodoxy. And so as soon as the Christians became less persecuted and became their own faith, with a strong set of believers and actually eventually becoming the majority, they maintained this concept of the Pax Deorum by saying, okay, within our church, we have to maintain a sense of harmony, divine harmony, so that God will bless us. And so they created things like liturgy, things like hymns, things like what people call the Eucharist or communion. They created these different things that had to be done or else God might not bless our church. And the only reason why I bring this up is not to sit here and say that these things are bad. Hymns are not bad. Liturgy's not bad. Doing communion clearly is not bad. I mean, Christ told us to do it. But it's understanding that this idea that things have to be done in an exact certain way or else God won't be happy, that is not a Christian belief. This is paganism that has worked its way into the church starting way back when. But yet so many people today fall into this exact same thing. And that's actually the great irony in how so many Christians will exhibit their faith today. They'll sit here and act as if somehow we're not being Christian enough if we don't fall into compliance with their set of beliefs or with their practice of faith. When in reality, the only thing we really see Christ and the apostles urging us to do is to love one another. And love doesn't necessarily have an exact format or an exact syntax. In fact, it can't, because the world is always innovating new ways to hurt others. It's always innovating new ways to other different individuals and to cast others into the shadows. And so for that reason, we can't be strong into just kind of saying, well, I'm just going to do the same thing all the time, and if I do that, I could be a good little Christian. The reality is the mission field is always changing, and the calling is always remaining the same. So how do we rectify those two? We have to be willing to hold up on a pedestal what is truly important, which is not our rituals and it's not our tradition, it's our calling, and it's the heart that we need to have as we pursue it. It may be a hot take, but the reality is that there are an awful lot of Christians running around today in pursuit of what they consider to be pure faith and pure religion, who in fact are really just pursuing some image of paganism. They're pursuing something that looks an awful lot like religions gone by rather than it does the life of Christ. Christ didn't live for a specific set of practices. In fact, you see him actually pushing back against the Pharisees and the religious leaders whenever his disciples would violate some of the ceremonial law, when they would sit here and do a little bit of what we would call work on the Sabbath and things like that. Why is that? Because Christ, being fully divine, understood that all of those rituals and ceremonies are only useful if there's purpose behind them, and that purpose cannot exist to glorify ourselves. The purpose of everything we do as a church needs to focus on God. It needs to focus on amplifying God's love, on projecting His compassion, on demonstrating His grace, and in doing that, it pursues His glory. That is the purpose of every single thing we do as individual Christians and as a collective church family. And so if that is the case, and if that is true, then the challenge for us is to look concerningly at our own lives and to look discerningly at the things we do as a church and as a collective and ask ourselves, what are we pursuing? Are we pursuing a religion of our own making, or are we pursuing a religion that was established by something far more divine than ourselves? What we should be after is a faith that looks a lot like Jesus and a lot less like a set of traditions. That's the message I have for you today. I hope you got something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.